Hi guys, welcome to CADS 3853 module number 17. Alright, in this module we're going to talk about stock planning method. Okay, especially we're going to focus on the one kind of stock planning method called the SSR method. When we plan our stock levels, the conundrum really is about finding the right balance. That is a very hard thing to do because a lot of times more stock actually means more sales, right? And less stock means lower sales. Okay, when you have, kind of intuitively, if you think about it, if you have more stuff, chances are somebody's going to like some of it, and you will be able to sell stuff, right? So, customers will be able to find something that they like. If you have lower stock, that means customers will have less chance to find something that they will like. So in kind of intuitively, you can think that more stock means higher sales. But we cannot just increase stock level unlimitedly because more stock means lower return on investment, right? So as compared to the inventory that we have, we're not going to be able to generate as much sales, right? So it's in relative terms, more stock means lower return on investment, and less stock means a higher return on investment, right? So that this becomes a really balanced conundrum. Okay, which way should we go? So the final conclusion is that we have to find the optimal level of stock that would assure enough sufficient sales that will cover the sales plan or sales goals we have, while it will also meet our efficiency in the inventory investment. Therefore, we need to use the inventory efficiency goal to calculate the amount of stock needed to meet that inventory efficiency goal. Okay? There are three different methods of stock planning. Okay? The first method is the SSR method. Okay? The second method is week supply method. And the third method we're going to talk about is the basic stock method. Among these three different methods of stock planning, the SSR method uses what we call stock sales ratio as the inventory efficiency measure. We have not learned this measure yet. Okay? The week supply method and the basic stock method, those two methods of stock planning, use the inventory turnover as the efficiency measure or efficiency goal. Okay, we have learned about turnover before, right? So in this module, we're going to focus on the SSR method, and we're going to first learn about the stock sales ratio as an inventory efficiency measure, and then and also learn about how to utilize this SSR or stock sales ratio to actually plan the stock level. Okay, so let's first talk about what SSR or stock sales ratio actually is. It's a measure of the stock efficiency in generating sales. So it's like a ratio between the stock level and then sales level. If you remember, the turnover is also some kind of ratio between stock and sales, right? Well, whereas turnover is calculated for any period of time, it could be a seasonal turnover or annual turnover or quarterly turnover, and etc. Stock sales ratio is always calculated for each month. Okay, so SSR is always a monthly figure, and we plan an SSR for each month separately. So the formula to calculate SSR is SSR equals BOM stock level at the retail value divided by the sales of that month. Okay, if you remember what BOM is, BOM means beginning of month, right? So it's a beginning of month stock level divided by sales of that month. Okay, so SSR is basically the ratio between the beginning of month stock level of a month and that month's sales. So given this concept of SSR, okay, if you want to plan your BOM stock level, then you can multiply the SSR and sales for the month to be able to calculate the BOM stock, right? So planned BOM stock at the retail value will be planned SSR. So you have to have an SSR planned out for that particular month. And you time that by the sales that you plan for the month. And that's going to give you what the BOM stock level has to be for that month. So at the beginning of the month, how much stock do you need to carry? So let's take a look at this example. Let's say the January had a BOM of $19,000 and sales of $9,100. If that was what the history said in January, okay? Then the SSR will be the BOM of January divided by the sales of January. So $19,000 divided by $9,100. That would be 2.09. So SSR of 2.09 is calculated. Well, how do we interpret this number, the meaning of this SSR? What's the meaning? Considering that the SSR is stock to sales ratio, okay, this SSR of 2.09 basically means that you used or needed $2.09 in stock at the beginning of the month, the BOM, to achieve $1 in sales during the month. Okay, so it's like for each dollar sales, okay, you prepared or used the beginning of month stock level of $2.09. Okay, that's the meaning of it. So when we utilize this SSR to plan our BOMs, the way we use SSR or the SSR method of stock planning is like this. First, we will look at last year's SSR. Okay, so for example, let's say in February last year's sales was 18,500 and last year's BOM was 27,600. Okay, given these two numbers, we can calculate the SSR. SSR is BOM divided by sales, right? So SSR is calculated as 1.49. Okay, we can do the same thing for March. Then, if we plan that this year's SSR will be the same as last year's SSR, okay? In our recollection of last year's performance, if there was nothing wrong with the way the inventory moved through the store in February and March, that means our SSR in February and March in last year were, kind of good, right? So if we plan that we're going to have the same level of SSR, okay, for this year, then we utilize that SSR for planning this year's BOM. Okay, how do we do that? Okay, remember, we can plan BOM based on planned sales and planned SSR, right? Now that we plan that this year's SSR is going to be the same as last year's SSR, we can use last year's SSR to plan our this year's BOM by multiplying this year's sales planned for each month by the last year's SSR planned for or calculated for each month. Okay, because we planned that this year's SSR is going to be the same as last year's actual SSR. If we plan that this year's SSR should be different from last year's SSR, then we will have to adjust this SSR planned for this year so that it won't be the same as last year's SSR. So it all depends on how the buyer actually plans this year's SSR is going to be, whether they want it to be the same as last year's SSR or they want to adjust the last year's SSR to be make it more optimal for the store. It's all up to the planning process. Okay, so in this example for February, for example, that's because we're planning this year's SSR to be the same as last year's SSR. We're going to use the 1.49 SSR, multiply that by this year's sales plan for February. So this year we wanted to sell a little bit more than last year, so 19,600. You time these two numbers together, we get that this year's BOM for February as $29,204. And we do the same thing for March. Okay, so basically first calculate last year's SSR, okay, and then if we want last year's SSR to be the same as this year's SSR, we just use that and multiply that by this year's sales to get this year's BOM. We need to understand SSR in relative to turnover because both SSR and turnover are some kind of a stock and sales ratio, right? But they are different. Okay, so how are they different? Let's think about it. Okay, well, I gave you the formula for both turnover and SSR on this slide, and you can take a look at these formulas and kind of see the clear differences between these two numbers. Turnover uses sales and stock. SSR uses stock and sale, right? So what are the differences? The first difference is that the SSR is calculated for each month separately. It's a monthly figure, monthly plan, right? Because SSR uses the stock at the level of the BOM, right? Beginning of month stock, okay? As well as the sales should be a monthly sale. Whereas turnover, it could be a series of months. It could be quarter, season, year. It could be also calculated for just 1 month, but it doesn't have to be just 1 month, right? Whereas SSR has to be for just 1 month. The second difference between the SSR and the turnover is that the SSR uses the inventory at the BOM level, beginning of month level, whereas the turnover, for turnover calculation, the inventory actually meant the average inventory throughout the season, throughout the quarter, throughout the year, whatever periods that the turnover was calculated for. The last difference you probably already noticed is that the numerator and denominator were reversed, right? For turnover, sales is the numerator, whereas the SSR, sales is the denominator. So SSR is stock to sales ratio, whereas turnover is sales to stock ratio. Okay? This difference makes their interpretations different, right? For turnover, it is how many dollars of sales are generated for every dollar in average stock. Whereas SSR, how many dollars of stock was needed in the beginning of the month for every dollar sales that you want to make. So the interpretation becomes different because of all these differences, especially because the numerator and denominator got reversed. Since we are going to learn about 3 different stock planning methods, we need to understand when should we use each of these different stock planning methods. SSR method is especially appropriate for merchandise that need immediate response, like fashion merchandise. The fashion changes affect the change in the demand, the sales, right? So while it's in fashion, you have to have the merchandise in, right? Because if you just wait a while, it may not be sold as well. So you need to have enough merchandise, okay, while it's in fashion. So for that matter, your stock and sales are kind of expected to change proportionately, right? That means you need to have enough stock to plan for your sales, and your stock should be planned in proportion to your sales. And also fashion merchandise tend to have a high turnover because you want them to move through the store pretty quickly, right? Fashion or seasonal merchandise the same way. Whereas basic merchandise or staple merchandise that you can sell, regardless of the fashion change or regardless of the calendar change or climate change, they tend to move through the store pretty slowly. So they are low turnover merchandise. So for merchandise that need immediate response to the demand changes or high turnover merchandise, okay, again, the merchandise that moves through the store pretty quickly, we need to have enough merchandise planned out for the amount of sales that we want to generate. So you want to plan the ratio between the stock and sales so that the stock will be higher than the sales that you are planning on. But given that, it's very necessary to establish the proper SSR for each individual month. You do not have to use the same SSR for every month, and in fact, you should not use the same SSR for each month. Okay? Usually, you expect the SSR to be higher in lower sales month and lower in higher sales month. Okay, we'll see why. Here's a simple example. Let's say the planned sales for like 2 different months are given here. Okay, for 1 month, the planned sales are $20,000. In another month, your planned sales are $100,000. So your sales are fluctuating between months, right? Your sales are not consistent across 12 months, right? So when this is the case, the planned SSR, if you planned SSR to be exactly the same for both months, let's say 2.5 for both months, in that case, your planned BOM stock level for these 2 months is going to be the first month $50,000, so the sales times SSR, right? But the second month is going to be $250,000. Okay, so imagine that you're gonna have $50,000 worth of stock at the beginning of the first month. Okay, and then you're gonna end up selling $20,000 as you planned. Then what you're gonna have left in the store is going to be $30,000. Okay, that was kind of your safety stock, right? So in case you sell more, you want to have this stock kind of way. But for the second month, okay, if you had a BOM stock of $250,000 and you sold $100,000 as you planned, then what you're going to end up with is $150,000 worth of stock. Okay, so in the first month you're going to have only $30,000 safety stock, whereas in the second month you're going to have a whole lot of safety stock just sitting around in the store, not getting sold and stuff like that. So you would want to adjust this planned SSR level for the second month to be lower, right? So that you're not going to have to deal with such high remaining merchandise, unsold merchandise sitting in the store at the end of the month. So in this next example, you see that the same planned sales for the 2 months are planned, but we're changing the SSR so that we're going to have a little bit higher SSR for the lower sales month. So SSR of 3 was planned for the $20,000 sales month. And then a whole lot lower SSR for the second month when we have a high sales planned out, so 1.8 SSR. In that case, if you do the math, the BOM stock for the first month is going to be $20,000 times 3, so that's $60,000. Whereas the second month, we're going to have the BOM of $180,000. And if the sales go as we planned, then we are going to have $40,000 left worth of stock left in the store at the end of the first month, whereas $80,000 stock left in the store at the end of the second month, right? In comparison to the first table, the table in the above, you can definitely see that we're not going to have a really huge excessive amount of stock just sitting around in the store unsold at the end of the second month as compared to the $150,000 safety stock that we ended up having with the above table, the table above, right? So this is why we want to utilize different SSRs for different months so that we are going to be able to have enough merchandise to support our sales that we plan. And we're going to have enough amount of stock for continuing sales, but we don't need to have excessive amount of stock left around in the store at the end of each month. Alright, so let's work on one practice problem here. Okay, in February last year, you began the month with $83,000 of merchandise on hand. So that $83,000 will be your BOM, beginning of month, stock level for February last year. Okay, and you had sales of $36,000 in February last year. Okay, now for this year, you are planning sales of $40,000. Now you also want to plan your BOM stock for this year using the SSR method. Okay, if you can assume that this year's SSR will be the same as last year's SSR, then what will be the level of planned BOM stock for February this year? That's the question. Let's pause the video here and work on the problem. We need to first calculate the SSR and then solve for BOM, right? Okay, so last year's SSR was last year's BOM over last year's sales for February. So 83,000 over 36,000. So it came up as 2.31. Okay, but we are assuming that last year's SSR is going to be the same as this year's SSR. So we can use this 2.31 as this year's SSR to plan this year's BOM for February. Therefore, this year's BOM for February is going to be this year's planned sales for the February, $40,000, times the SSR we just planned, 2.31. So that is $92,400 worth of stock has to be used for the beginning of month of February. So that was pretty simple. Let's work on another problem. Okay, so now we have 2 months, August and September. Okay, let's plan this year's BOM stock for both months, August and September, using last year's SSRs. So first calculate the SSR from last year, and then use that to plan this year's BOM. Okay, so first let's calculate the SSR. SSR is BOM over sales. So for August, it's 2,400 over 2,000. Okay, so that equals to 1.2. And for September, we do the same kind of math. We got 1.13 as our SSR. Okay, this year's BOM will be now SSR times the planned sales for each month. So we got the $2,640 BOM for August and $3,729 BOM for September. Okay. So far, we've been using the assumption that we can use last year's SSR for planning this year's BOM stock, right? But that assumption is just a buyer's plan. So some buyers may plan it completely differently. So they actually plan different SSRs than last year's SSRs, and that's perfectly fine as long as these new SSRs make sense in terms of the operation. So you kind of have to remember what happened last year, whether everything went fine or when you felt like you were short of merchandise, something like that, and you plan accordingly. Alright, so this concludes module number 17. And please work on module problem assignment number 17. And thanks for listening. Bye-bye.